Thank you. Thank you. Great. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Well, Secretary Clinton, welcome back to Google.
It's great to be here, Eric. Thank you. You've grown a little bit since I've been here last. Just a little.
Are you talking about my weight? I knew I'd gained some pounds here. No, the company is much larger and even more successful, and thank you for your first visit. We're here to talk about your book, which I've actually read.
Thank you.
I did want to present you with my book, and it's entitled How Google Works, and I want you to notice something that's different between your book and my book. Now your book is 600 pages and lots and lots of words. My book is 37 pages, and it uses big type, and my book has black and white photos, and yours has color photos. So on a pound-for-pound basis, my book is more valuable.
Well, but there are many things you can do with my book that you can't do with this book.
Such as?
Well, you can
foreign
work out.
Policy?
No, you can work out with my book.
You can work out with your book?
Absolutely. And if you get two
Sort of
copies,
weightlifting?
you'll be balanced while you're working out. You can use it as a doorstop. This would just slip under the door. You can't imagine using that as a doorstop. So, I don't know. I think it's kind of just a draw, don't you think?
Well, at some point, we're going to be talking about my book, but I want you to notice that my book is so short, you can read it during this interview.
Well, I have to say, there is a particularly attractive picture of you on page 31 wearing some kind of ridiculous hat with some model of an airplane.
And a picture of Bill Gates in the back. Let's get to work. So, Secretary Clinton, your book is entitled Hard Choices, and what we're going to do is we're going to have some questions from me. We have some Dory questions that is submitted from the audience, and we have some live questions as well. And the first question I want to ask is that you and I had a very dear friend, Richard Holbrooke, who died unexpectedly of a heart attack. And you had appointed him to do the negotiation in Afghanistan. Do you think that his death affected the outcome in Afghanistan as a brilliant negotiator? Did we miss him that much? Did we end up in roughly the right place in Afghanistan at the end of it all?
Well, there's two parts to that question. Let me address our friend Richard Holbrooke first. He was, in my view, the premier diplomat of our generation. He was dramatic when called for. He was persistent. He was tough-minded. But he believed passionately that you couldn't end a war if you didn't talk to the people on the other side. Now, that may sound simplistic, but indeed, that's a huge obstacle for many in diplomacy, politics, governments to get over. How do you end a war if you talk to the people you despise, who you view as the troublemakers, the instigators? And Richard came at the assignment I asked him to take on behalf of the President and myself with that strong conviction born out of his many years of experience, and in particular his ending of the wars in the Balkans when my husband was president. He spent a lot of time with Milosevic, a most unsavory character. He drank with him, he yelled at him, he bullied him, he listened to him, and eventually was able to get to the Dayton Peace Accords, which ended the war, even though it didn't end all of the political and ethnic and other problems that are unfortunately still prevalent. When I asked him to take on the task in Afghanistan and Pakistan, he went at it with his same level of commitment, even relish. And as I write in the book, we were beginning a process of reaching out to and responding to outreach from the Taliban. And I gave a speech that tried to make the case that that might be distasteful. It certainly was to me for many reasons as to how they treat people in general and women in particular. But there had to be a political negotiation in order to try to end the conflict. And literally the day he died, he suffered a terrible attack in my office. We were talking about the first meeting that we had engineered between an American diplomat, one of Richard's lieutenants, and a representative of Mullah Omar. I guess the short answer, Eric, is that Richard would never take no for an answer. We had a lot of difficulties, both with President Karzai, because he didn't want us talking to the Taliban, and we had problems with the Taliban because they didn't want to talk to President Karzai. So we were playing a kind of multi-level chess game and trying to move the parties closer to talking to each other. And unfortunately, with Richard's death, we kept up the initiative, but we didn't have that same overpowering presence that he brought to it. Now, where we are with Afghanistan and Pakistan, because we looked at them very much as presenting similar challenges to a lasting peace and to threats, first of all, to the region and even beyond, is an election that was held that has been criticized for irregularities that now finally, and I give Secretary Kerry credit for going there. There's no substitute for going to these places and staying and trying to engineer some kind of solution, that there will now be a total audit of all the votes in Afghanistan to determine who the next president is. And things are kind of on hold until we know that. What I think of as the three biggest challenges is, number one, getting a new president in who can keep Afghanistan unified. Despite all of the problems that many of us had with President Karzai, that was his primary goal, to try to keep the country unified and not fly off in different ethnic directions. And we need to support whoever that next president is and do our best to give him the authority that he needs to try to keep the country unified. Secondly, continuing to work with the Afghan security forces. They have proven to be much more dependable, effective fighters, taking the fight to the Taliban, because the Taliban is very clear that they intend to reoccupy territory they lost to coalition troops in the last several years following the surge that President Obama ordered. So continuing to work and support the Afghan security forces. And then finally, being well aware that so many of the problems in Afghanistan are incubated in Pakistan. And the Pakistani government is now facing some of the most serious threats that it historically has, because, as I say in the book, they had an idea that was never going to be workable for the long term, which is you can keep poisonous snakes in your backyard and expect them only to bite your neighbors. And the Pakistani military and intelligence establishment have, unfortunately, over years, worked with, supported lots of the terrorist groups, extremist groups, for their own purposes, some of which was to keep Afghanistan kind of off kilter. So there has to be a lot of effort made to work with the Pakistanis, as difficult as that is. And that's something that I spent some time on in the book, because I worked very hard to try to have as effective a relationship as we could. But at the end of the day, the Pakistanis have to stand up to the threat from within, which is also a threat to Afghanistan, and, by the way, a continuing threat to India. So we've made progress, but not nearly enough.
I was in Pakistan a little bit after you were, and I found it incredibly confusing to figure out. In fact, while I was there, the president I met with was gotten rid of by the Supreme Court over something involving financial and his child. In the book, you spent a fair amount of time on, I think, one of the significant foreign policy achievements during your tenure involving the pivot to Asia.
Right.
And when I lay it out, right, we've got the Pakistan problems. You were the first person to really open up Burma, Myanmar, met with Aung San Suu Kyi, et cetera. But you start looking at, like, as an example, the Spratly Islands and this line called Line 9 between China and Japan and the others. It's getting more confusing to an outsider. You talk about the pivot. Do you think that we understand how to navigate now between these? Each of these countries is becoming more nationalistic as it becomes stronger.
Right. Well, that is a trend that I saw really beginning to take off, and it has a number of implications, both for the region, but also for us and the rest of the world. As China has gotten much more economically powerful, it's understandable that they want to project their power, but it's quite threatening to the rest of the region. And what I saw as a growing threat was the increasing budgetary resources going to the People's Liberation Army to build up their naval capacity so that they could project power on the seas. Now, the United States primarily has kept the peace in Asia, in navigable waters for the protection of commerce. And our Navy has been a very positive force. But it's clear to me that the Chinese intend to challenge American naval superiority. That's their perfect right to do so. They are a sovereign country. They get to make those decisions. But the problems that Eric alluded to are having a rebound effect around the region. So that if you see China developing its first aircraft carrier with plans for a number of more carriers, and you see China being quite aggressive on territorial claims, not that they're willing to arbitrate those claims, but they're merely asserting them against the Philippines and Vietnam and Japan primarily now. And you see that this could lead to increasing tension and maybe even conflict in the region. Then we have an opportunity, but also a responsibility to work closely with, number one, our allies, because we have mutual defense treaties with 5 nations in the region, obviously Japan and South Korea and the Philippines, Australia, but also Thailand. So we are treaty bound to work with and, if necessary, protect our allies. Nobody wants to see any kind of conflict that erupts, but when you look at what's happening between China and Vietnam, and China and Japan, and China and the Philippines, this is going to take some very careful management. And so it takes a combination of America continuing to assert itself as a Pacific power, but intensive diplomacy to try to send the message to China, why would you want to disrupt 40% of global trade? Why would you want to skirt the edges of potential conflict? And you see what's happening in Japan. Japan is getting much more nationalistic and aggressive in response to that. So this is going to be a primary obligation and area of concern for the United States going forward.
It's very important that China, it ultimately does not become China and the people who are opposed to China.
Yes.
And you could set up for another 100 years some sort of a real contest.
Well, you know, one of the things, and I write about this because I became aware, you know, China had, when I became Secretary of State, 2 issues that they repeatedly stressed as their core interests: Tibet and Taiwan. I mean, that was, every time you met with a Chinese official, what you would hear, in addition to everything else. And, you know, they were confused by our support for the Tibetans, our openness to the Dalai Lama. I had a really vigorous disagreement with Jiang Zemin, who was president at the end of the 90s, over Tibet, because I kept saying, China's a great country. I mean, you're growing at 10+% in those years. Why are you so obsessed with Tibet? And he said, why are you so obsessed with Tibet? And we had, you know, this big back and forth. And I said, my goodness, somebody meets with the Dalai Lama and you want to write them out of the, you know, the global order practically. But it's very deeply felt by the Chinese, and on Taiwan, obviously you all know. Starting in 2010, I'm in one of these very long meetings that are made longer because you have to have consecutive translation in many of them. Some of you have done business on behalf of Google in China, you know that. And all of a sudden it was Tibet, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. And I just sat up straight. And I thought, what do you mean the South China Sea? So I began to engage with my counterparts. I heard you mention the South China Sea. What did you mean? Oh, well, what we meant was, of course, that we claim the South China Sea. I said, all of it? I mean, this enormous body of water? Absolutely, it is China's. And then, you know, they began telling me why it was China's. They found pottery shards on this island or this atoll or this rocky reef that went back to the Ming Dynasty. It therefore was China. I said, really? Now, let me say this to you. The United States, and
you can just hear her saying that. Really?
I actually had a map drawn up where the United States claimed the entire Pacific. And I said, look, you know, you were our ally, but you couldn't have beaten the Japanese back, and you couldn't have had the kind of economic rise without American power. And we have, we have old cans of food everywhere. You may have pottery shards, but we've left our debris too. And so we're claiming the entire Pacific. I said, this is an absurd argument. Oh no, very serious. And not only that, we're claiming the East China Sea. And we're going after the Senkakus, which the Japanese have claimed. And we're going after the territorial waters of Vietnam, because obviously they want to drill to see what might be off their coast. This was a very well thought out introduction of a third core interest. And therefore, we have to take it very seriously. And what I've argued, and I've made this very clear to our Chinese friends, the United States doesn't take positions on these islands and who should govern them or who they belong to. But where there are disputes, we have dispute resolution mechanisms that China, as a great nation, should be part of taking advantage of. And so this is going to be an ongoing debate between us and within the region.
So to show you how good this book is, there's a lengthy conversation about the origins of this, and the Secretary talks about the original hide and bide strategy that Deng Xiaoping had, and how much has changed. You also spent a fair amount of time talking about a genuine hero in the world, Aung San Suu Kyi.
Right.
And you describe her as there was a quiet dignity about her, the coiled intensity of a vibrant mind inside of a long imprisoned body.
Right.
The sort of glimpses of the way you I found absolutely fascinating. I'd like to move to an area where you say hard choices. I personally see no choices, and that's Syria. Mm-hmm. And you're famously known for having been, or at least allegedly being, in favor of earlier intervention. And I just want to review where we are now. 170,000 deaths, 11.5 million internally dislocated people, 3 million refugees. 1 out of 6 people in Lebanon, 1 out of 5 people in Jordan are now refugees. Imagine if that happened from Canada and Mexico to the United States, the impact on the economy. And if that's not bad enough, it's the biggest humanitarian conflict in the world today. There's no obvious groups to support. It's a proxy war involving Russia, Iran, Syria, et cetera. And now the latest is, of course, this ISIS group, which has managed to get to some number of miles to Baghdad. It's not clear what to do. Do you do a no-fly zone? Well, who do you protect, right? If you're going to arm somebody, who you're going to arm. When you think about it, had we followed what you wanted to do, what would we have done, and what should we do now, or what can we do now? You talk about this in the book, but obviously you don't talk about the current ISIS situation. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think it's the biggest current problem in the world in terms of just mass death and problems.
Well, Eric, I label that chapter a wicked problem, which is a futurist concept because there really weren't any clear decisions with a straight line to consequences. Even if you made account for unintended consequences, it was always going to be a hard choice. What I argued back at the beginning of the conflict was that in looking at Assad's crackdown and his alliances with Iran, Russia, and Iran's proxy, Hezbollah in Lebanon, there would be a very serious issue. Somebody need some help back there? Can we help? How about some water? Is there somebody pass out? Yeah. Okay.
I think we're fine.
We got somebody back there to help.
Okay. Let's continue.
Okay. If you looked at the level of violence that Assad was willing to use, and I was pretty sure from the beginning he would do whatever it took to beat back the demonstrators and to hold on to territory. His father had done it before him, some of you might recall, in leveling the city of Hama, which had been a hotbed of opposition and a particular home for Muslim Brotherhood opponents to the prior regime. So I had no doubt. In fact, one of the stories I tell in the book, I asked the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, Saud al-Faisal, who had been in that position for many years, whether he thought there was any way to change the calculation of Assad and have him either begin to tamp down the violence or look for a political settlement. And Saud said no, because his mother would never let him. And that, I thought, was very telling, that there was this family obligation enforced by his mother, who would say to him every day, here's what your father would have done. So given that lineup of characters, history, and the like, I believe that if we had gone in to identify and properly vet members of the original opposition, which were not al-Qaeda, were not ISIS, they may have been pharmacists or doctors or lawyers or students before the opposition rose up against Assad's brutal crackdown, that we would get to know who the likely hard men on the other side were, and perhaps we could help to build from that a viable opposition force that could hold ground against Assad and at the same time be the anchor for developing a more effective political arm. You know, I could sit here today and say I was right, but I can't say that because we don't know what would have happened had we followed that particular approach. There were very good arguments on the other side. But what I know now is that what I worried about has happened, that Assad has not moderated his behavior. The only good thing that has come out of the last 2 years is the removal of at least the known stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, which I do think was an important accomplishment. But we know that territory is being taken by extremist groups, ISIS being the most audacious with their claim of a caliphate that crosses the border between Syria and Iraq. And I think we have a pretty good idea what that would mean for the region where you could possibly have a very extreme organized territory that was a safe haven and a launching ground. We saw this in Afghanistan. I mean, that's what happened in the border areas when al-Qaeda decided to ally itself with the Taliban and set up shop there. And it doesn't necessarily mean just misery for Sunnis who are not of their extreme nature and others within Iraq and the same within Syria. It can lead to problems in Europe, where we think at least 2,000 Europeans with passports have gone to fight with extremist groups, and it certainly can mean more threats to us. So what to do now? I think part of what we have to do is what we're trying to do, and that is to restabilize Iraq. And the reason it's so difficult is that Prime Minister Maliki basically reneged on every commitment he made to the United States, as well as his own people, when he was legitimately elected. He was able to form a government the first time. He was just reelected. And the problem is that he began governing in an exclusive sectarian way, cutting the Sunnis out of power, refusing to pay the Sunni fighters that the United States had recruited to get rid of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was one of our major achievements on behalf of the Iraqis before we left, and refusing to have a fair deal over oil revenues with the Kurds. So the Kurds and a lot of the Sunni tribal leaders are basically of the mind that you can't trust Maliki, you can't work with him, and we're not going to support him as he tries to take back territory. So it's a political negotiation that we and others are engaged in, because unless you can get the local Sunni leaders once again to throw their lot in on behalf of a unified Iraq, you cannot drive ISIS out of Mosul and other places that it has seized.
And ISIS is very dangerous by every measure.
Well, they're very dangerous. They're kind of a follow-on to the original al-Qaeda, but not as based in the leadership of bin Laden and Zawahiri. It's now younger people. They're more violent. They're more aggressive. They're trying to do what has been the dream of extremist Sunnis caught up in terrorism for a number of years now, and that is to establish, or in their mind, reestablish a caliphate and put one of their own in charge. So yeah, they're very dangerous, and they will not be satisfied in just governing territory. They will believe it's both their religious duty and their desire for greater power that they have to take this further afield.
So what I thought I'd do is ask you a little bit about the Israeli-Palestinian situation. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what you've been working on since leaving office, and then we'll go to questions, and we have thousands of questions, it being Google. So in the book, you talk at some length about negotiating and getting to know Bibi Netanyahu, who's a charismatic leader by any standard, and the challenges he's faced from the terrorism. And in the book, you talk a lot about Hezbollah and the Lebanon war and those sorts of things. Israel is today confronting the Gaza rockets, Hamas, and so forth. Looking at it, I was just there. Google has a big presence there. It's to some degree in Hamas's interest to have this cycle continue. They get money, they get resources, they're getting rockets out of Syria, et cetera. And the rockets can now reach the entire country. And I was thinking about, if you think about our good friends in Canada, right? So imagine Canada was different and somehow was raining rockets on us, or Mexico or whatever. People here would go crazy.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so you can really understand. In fact, the Israelis have built this thing called Iron Dome,
Yes.
which actually has intercepted 80 or 90% of the rockets, which is a remarkable technical achievement, and good for them. Do you have a reading of what's going to happen next? Because it doesn't seem to be getting better.
Well, you know, you might have seen the president doing a live press statement this morning from the White House, and he's asked Secretary Kerry to go to the region to try to reestablish the November 2012 ceasefire that I negotiated back at the time when rockets were raining on Israel. And I went from Cambodia to Israel to negotiate what the Israelis would accept, and then to go to Cairo to negotiate with then President Morsi. And we were able to reach a ceasefire that held until this month.
Until now.
And I'd make 3 points. One, Hamas really does have its back against the wall, and that's always dangerous. You know, they were basically driven out of Damascus because that's where they had taken up their headquarters for years. But when Assad consolidated the Alawite minority to go after the majority of the population, which are Sunnis, it became impossible for Hamas to maintain its headquarters there. They moved to Cairo because at the time, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate, Morsi, was the president. There was a lot of sympathy there. And they began to try to maneuver to control splinter groups within Gaza, because it's not just Hamas. There are some even harder core extremist groups within Gaza. So you have a couple of different groups led by Hamas gathering up more sophisticated weaponry. So when I negotiated the ceasefire with Morsi, he had never done anything like that, but he did have a relationship with Hamas. So we were able to come up with a written agreement where Israel made certain commitments, Hamas made certain commitments, and thankfully it was before there was an invasion. We were about 48 hours from an invasion. So what has happened since? Well, Morsi's gone. Al-Sisi is the president. He basically has declared the Muslim Brotherhood and everyone associated with them, which would include Hamas, are threats to the Egyptian state. So Hamas no longer has a partner in Cairo. The West Bank has remained, you know, fairly secure and stable, in part because of the attitude still in the West Bank that they'd rather have a negotiation than go back to resistance. So Hamas and its allies, who have really brought about the importation of more long-range rockets, has, for whatever combination of calculations decided that it's in their interest, as Eric said, to once again attack Israel. Maybe because they believe they will get more support, they will get more financial resources. Maybe they think that they will cause an uprising in the West Bank that would join with them. They have a number of different reasons why they might do this. So once they began firing the rockets, and the rockets have longer range and they're somewhat more accurate, but the Iron Dome, which the United States funded, but which is Israeli technology, has worked surprisingly well in intercepting 80–90% of the rockets. But there was also the increasing threat from tunnels. You know, it used to be that Hamas had tunnels going into the Sinai, and those were both for smuggling weapons, but also smuggling goods that would escape the Israeli embargo. The Egyptians have done a much more thorough job of shutting those tunnels down, but Hamas has been busy building tunnels into Israel with the primary purpose of attacking Israelis and trying to spark a very violent response. I can't believe that the current Hamas leadership did not know that if they kept up their attacks, Netanyahu would be forced to respond. As I said, when I got to Jerusalem for the first part of the negotiations, they were already sending out notices for reserve soldiers to begin mustering up, and that they were going to have to invade. So I believe that Hamas wanted to provoke this reaction. And I believe that Netanyahu, at the end of the day, the Canadian-Mexican example is, you know, not so far-fetched. I mean, any country, your first obligation is to protect your citizens, and I believe Netanyahu knew that he had to take action, and Israel has the right to self-defense. So now we're into not only a very unfortunate clash, but a propaganda war. You know, the terrible, horrible pictures of children who are the victims of Israeli military action, which Israel is right to say is in large measure, not completely, but in large measure, because of the way Hamas has sighted its rockets and set up its operating centers in neighborhoods, surrounded by civilians, in houses. The tunnels where there was a firefight with Hamas fighters coming out of one of the tunnels and Israeli soldiers, 2 Americans, dual citizens, 2 young American men serving in the IDF killed. So we have to try, if we can, to negotiate another ceasefire. Egypt declared a ceasefire. Israel accepted it. Hamas rejected it, in part because I do think they want to provoke what we're now seeing. And it's deeply distressing, but unfortunately, unless there's a mutual ceasefire, I think Israel will continue with their military objectives, which are to find and destroy the tunnels, find and destroy as many of the rockets as they can, and there will continue to be terrible loss of life.
And I agree, and it's very sad. Let's make a context switch. Since you left office, you've spent a great deal of time on empowerment, entrepreneurship, the role of women and children. Google has partnered with you a little bit on that. And I think people would be interested in, what do you think needs to be done? You've given a series of speeches about this, the role of women, and so forth. You're obviously committed to it. Take us through your thinking.
Well, I do want to thank Google and being one of our partners in this effort. When I got out of the State Department, I joined my husband and my daughter at the Clinton Foundation. My husband had started it, and I'm very proud of what he built. I had nothing to do with it. I was in the Senate and in the State Department for those 12 years, but he came up with an approach that I think is fairly called entrepreneurial philanthropy, where you bring people together through the foundation and through the Clinton Global Initiative to partner to solve problems. And we have very clear metrics. Are you making progress or not? And if you're not, then we're not going to keep doing what doesn't work, and we're going to do more of what does work. And we think we're all in this together, so both internationally and domestically, there's a number of really important projects. Bill has just left Borneo, where we're doing one of our climate initiatives trying to save the rainforest in Indonesia, partnering with a number of other governments and businesses. So when I got out, in addition to wanting to work on the foundation priorities and CGI priorities, I added 3. I added something we call Too Small to Fail. And that is a program aimed at persuading families to read, talk, and sing to their babies. Because what we know is if you're our daughter, Chelsea, or our new grandchild, you are going to be talked to and read to and sung to until probably you just want us to go away. And we're doing it both because it's great to build relationships and connection, but we now know from brain research it builds brains. And when a child from a family like one of ours goes to kindergarten, that child will have already heard 30 million more words than a child from a poor family. Now, that does not mean the child from the poor family is any less loved, any less treasured, but there's not the time or understanding often so that parents know they can be their child's first teachers. So we are partnering with the Next Generation Foundation in San Francisco and a number of other groups like Sesame Street to get this message out. Secondly, we rolled out at the Clinton Global Initiative America meeting in Denver last month a program that is aimed at trying to work with companies like Google. We'd love to talk to you about this, but to create ladders of opportunity for unemployed young people. We have 6 million young people in America between the ages of 18 and 24 who are neither in school nor at work. And that's terrible for them, and it's terrible for us and our economy. And then finally, I took with me my commitment to women and girls, their empowerment, their full participation. And my jumping off point is the speech that I gave in 1995 in Beijing, which was intended to make a very clear statement of the global priority that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. But accompanying that was a platform for action signed by 189 countries about what they would do to move toward full participation of women and girls. And we've made progress, but not nearly enough. So we started a program called No Ceilings, and it's got 3 purposes. Number 1, we want to be able, with Google's help and others, to get the best data possible so that we understand where the gaps are. We know, for example, we've made tremendous progress in getting girls into primary education, not so good in secondary education. So what are the gaps? How do we describe that? And how do we visualize it so people who may not be experts or advocates in this field can look and see what the remaining business is? I have a chapter called Unfinished Business, and it's really about what more we need to do. Now, there are big differences between the developing world and the developed world. In the developing world, we still have some very clear obstacles to overcome. We still have countries that don't even give birth certificates to girl babies because they're just not important enough to register. So when we say to ourselves, well, how many girls are in school? And a significant percentage don't even have birth certificates, and there's not a good census, how do we measure that? Or when we look at Asia, there are 3 million fewer girls and women than there are boys and men because they're not born, or they don't live to their 5th birthday, or they are victims of violence and neglect, and we have this huge gap. And I think one of the problems that China and India are facing, and will face even more, is the big gap between marriageable men and marriageable women. And some of the violence against women is a result of what is a very big imbalance. Now, in the so-called developed world, we've changed our laws, but what we have left are cultural problems. And so in addition to getting the data, where are the gaps, we want to look at what are the solutions, and they will vary from country to country, region to region. One of the efforts I made in the State Department was to begin to do with the IMF, the World Bank, and others, an economic analysis of what it means for girls and women to be left out of economies. Now, we know girls and women are in the informal economy, but that's not counted in GDP. I remember going to Africa in the 90s, and all I saw were women working. They were carrying water, they were carrying firewood, they were tending fields, they were in the marketplaces. And I asked an economist, I said, how do you take account of all this economic activity? And they said, we don't, because it's in the informal economy. So what I wanted was an analysis about what difference it would make if we had girls and women in the formal economy. And it makes a huge GDP difference. And the person in the world who has jumped on this more than anybody is Prime Minister Abe of Japan. Because when he took office on the promise he was going to get the economy going. And he looked at trade barriers, he looked at the lack of immigration. But one of the biggest problems was educated Japanese women were not in the economy. And that, in fact, if they had greater participation, the projection was the Japanese economy could go up to GDP.
So the quickest way to grow your economy is to use the talents you already have.
Use the talents you have
right?
and raise the talent base of women and girls in places where they're not educated, and take advantage of those talents in places where they are educated.
It seems so obvious. Why don't we just do it?
That's what we're trying to figure out, and with Google's help, we'll get the best analysis to make the recommendations.
We violently agree with. I want to finish up with the book with the last paragraph. You talk about the memorial service for your mom, who passed away recently, and you said, I looked at Chelsea, and I thought how proud your mom, was of her. Mom measured her own life by how much she was able to help us and serve others. I knew that if she was still with us, she would be urging us to do the same. Never rest on your laurels, never quit, never stop working to make the world a better place. That's our unfinished business. Is that why you work so hard?
It really is. I don't want to get all psychobabbly, but...
it's okay.
I so admire my mother because she had a miserable childhood. I mean, just horrible, abused, neglected, abandoned, sent by herself at the age of 7, 8, in charge of her younger sister who was about 6, put on a train by themselves in Chicago, sent to California to live with her paternal grandparents who did not want her. And just a terrible experience, and finally having to leave that home at the age of 13 to get a job, working in another family's home, taking care of their children in return for room and board, and the opportunity, if she could get her chores done in the morning, to go to school if she could get back in the afternoon. So, I mean, when I was a child, I didn't know any of this about my mother. I just knew that she was a great mom, and she was fun, and she, took wonderful care of us. But as I learned more about her life upon becoming a teenager and a young adult, I was just astonished, because I thought, so many things could have gone wrong. I mean, she could have given up. She could have been embittered. She could have, even if she'd gotten married and have children, she could have been as mean-spirited or neglectful as her mother and her grandmother were to her. But instead, she worked so hard to be a better person. And she never got to go to college, but she was always studying and trying to learn and believed passionately in education. And I think it did have a lot to do with my sense of service because, I remember going to babysit for the children of migrant farm workers who in Chicago, they would come up from Mexico and they'd pick crops, they'd go through Illinois, they'd go into Michigan. And our church had a babysitting program for the youngest children on Saturday mornings so that the school-age children who went to school with us would be able to go out into the fields. And so I remember babysitting these adorable little kids, and my mother learning that one of the little girls was going to have her first communion, and of course they didn't have money for a dress, and my mother took the mother of the little girl and bought a dress, and my mother was always trying to think of ways that just through her own efforts she could help somebody else, and encouraging me to do the same. So there's no doubt in my mind that she was my biggest inspiration, and her example was a great continuing reminder of what can happen. Because I'd end with this. I asked her once, I said, with all of your really suffering, what made the difference? How did you turn out the way you did? And she said to me, at so many points along the way, somebody was kind to me. wasn't my family, but it was somebody else. And she told me about literally when she was like 4 years old, and her parents were teenagers, totally irresponsible. They'd leave her for days. They'd give her, you know, a little bit of money, and she'd have to get herself down the stairs of the tenement they lived in and go next door to a restaurant and ask for food with a little bit of money. And she said, looking back, she said, I know they gave me more food than I could pay for. Or when she was in school and she would never have any lunch and never had any money to buy lunch, and the teacher noticed it, so the teacher, without embarrassing her, would bring an extra piece of fruit, would bring an extra carton of milk, and would say, oh, I've brought too much food. Dorothy, would you like something? Because I just can't eat all this. Again, not humiliating her, but making it possible for her to receive that kindness. And the family that she moved in to work for, it was the first time she was ever in an intact family that loved each other and cared about each other and had plans for the future. And she could see all of that. So it was just a great reminder. I mean, you don't have to go into full-time philanthropy or charitable work or faith-based work or politics, but there's always something you can do that helps somebody. And if you do it in a way that preserves their dignity and gives them the feeling that it was kindness as opposed to arrogance, it can make a huge difference. So I think that left a great impression on me.
There is a very nice picture of you and your mom, Chelsea and Mark, in the book.
Yeah.
We have questions from the audience. Let's get some folks lined up here. But there's a ranking system that we use of questions. And the overwhelming ranking throughout the company, and this is being watched all around the world in Google, is a question about the NSA. And as you know, Google is quite opposed, along with the other tech companies, to what we see as overreach by the NSA.
Right.
And we all think, for example, that bugging Angela Merkel's phone is, pretty stupid, if I could be blunt. What is your opinion of NSA spying, surveillance, the domestic violence? This occurred, I think, after you were there.
Right.
Do you have an opinion about this? Number one question from Google.
Well, yeah. I mean, don't do stupid things. And that doesn't mean we don't need to have a system of surveillance, because we do. I mean, I think that has to be accepted. But how we do it and how we explain it and what we tell our partners is incredibly important. I was just in Berlin on my book tour in Europe, and of course that was the number one issue. And I said, look, Angela Merkel's a friend of mine, and I apologized to her. It was wrong. It shouldn't have been done.
Well, she thought, I had dinner with her, and she looked at me and said, what are they doing, listening to my conversation with my mother?
Yeah.
I mean, people remember this.
Oh, absolutely. And look, I think we were beginning to take a hard look at what we did post 9/11. And that was happening. The president had actually given a speech before the Snowden disclosures about the need to take a hard look at the legislation and how it was being implemented. So we had to do that, because I voted for things and then I voted against things, trying to figure out how to get the right balance in security and liberty, the age-old question. And we have to do a much better job, and we have to do it in a way that doesn't affect our great companies like Google, because clearly that would be unfortunate for us.
Let's go here. Go ahead for your first question, and then we'll go over here.
Secretary Clinton, thank you for joining us today. I wanted to get your take on the state of Congress and internal politics within the U.S. It seems like things are getting increasingly polarized to the point of dysfunction. I think that the kick-the-can economic policy that we're building is really hurting our country. So I'm wondering what you think needs to be done to fix it, and who the right people are to lead that effort.
Well, I think your question is exactly on point. I think we have two crises right now in our country. We have an economic crisis that has to do with both growth and inequality. You may not feel it here at Google, but it's real in the lives of many Americans, and we need to get back to doing smarter things in terms of economic policies. And we have a political crisis. I would even argue it's a crisis of our democracy, because it's not functioning. And I would make three quick points. First, having been in and around politics for a long time, please don't get indifferent or disgusted and walk away from it, because truly the best way of changing what's going on is through voting. I mean, that may sound simplistic, but I've been there, I've seen it, I know it can work. And I would have just a few pieces of advice. Don't vote for anyone who says he or she will never compromise, and does it proudly. You know, they have all the answers. They may even have a direct channel to the divine, so they know what should be done. And therefore, they're going to Washington or they're going to Sacramento, wherever they're going, and they will never compromise. That is death to a democracy. I don't know if any of you saw the great Steven Spielberg movie about Lincoln and trying to get the 13th Amendment passed. There was just a great a great play in New York called All the Way about LBJ trying to get civil rights passed. You've got to compromise if you're going to make progress. And so don't vote for people. Don't give them money. Don't encourage them. You can be conservative, but find people who understand the meaning of conservative. It's not radicalism. It's conserving and trying to build on institutions that work. And then finally, to go to the final part of your question, it's not only what citizens should do in terms of voting and contributing and trying to pick people who will be better partners in solving our problems, but it's what leaders themselves have to do. And Washington is now set up for dysfunction. People are elected often with the best intentions, and then they get there and they spend all their time raising money so that they can be reelected the next time instead of doing the work that they were elected to do the first time. And they also are rarely with each other. It didn't used to be that way. You met across the aisle, you met across the ideological divide, and we're not doing that. So people don't get to know each other. And so I think if you are running for one of these offices, you just have to be absolutely committed to spending a lot of time trying to build relationships, because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. You have to have enough trust, enough understanding to be able to make decisions. And that's what we're missing right now.
I would also add, I have to bring your book back. And quote, "In general, I was surprised at how many people in Washington operated in an evidence-free zone, where data and science are disregarded." You then go on and quote an unnamed senior Bush administration official, who I'm dying to figure out who this is, who said, "The reality-based community of people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. I've always thought that's exactly how to solve problems." The Bush aide went on, "That's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality." That attitude helps explain a lot of what went wrong during those years.
Well,
so maybe the answer is also let's go back to we can debate the principles and so forth, but let's make sure the data is correct.
Well, and what a place to talk about this. I mean, that's exactly, I used to give speeches about being in an evidence-free zone in the Senate, and we've got to figure out a better way of breaking down the intellectual barriers that exist between people of different political beliefs. There's some recent research that's been done, and I would welcome any of your thoughts on this, that shows if you hold an opinion strongly, like let's just pick supply-side economics, trickle-down economics, which don't work. There's no evidence that it works, but it is deeply believed by people. Or that immigration is bad for the United States, totally wrong. Evidence to the contrary going
Can we just pause?
miles for miles. Yes.
Isn't that amazing? We just heard this. Right.
No.
Right. This country was built on immigration.
100%. And so we know we have evidence, but oftentimes it's difficult to break through the psychological barriers to hearing that. So we've got to do a better job. And I think about this a lot because of the dysfunction. Some people deny climate change because they think they are doing it to protect industries they make money from or they get contributions from. Some people deny it because they don't understand the science and they kind of, just throw up their hands, and it's easier to say, oh, well, it'll all work out. Some people deny it for religious reasons, whatever. That's just one example of an issue that we are gridlocked over, and thank goodness for President Obama beginning to do things that will deal with climate change through executive action. But how do we begin to have a conversation again where we actually listen to each other? Because we are much less sexist, much less racist, much less homophobic than we were a decade or two ago. But boy, the one remaining bias we have is we don't want to be around people who share a different political opinion. You know, we just don't want to argue with them, we don't want to listen to them, and it's on both sides of the divide. So we've got to do a better job.
A question over here.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Secretary Clinton. I was hoping we could use some of your experience in dealing with rather difficult international crises and controversies with one of the deep controversies affecting us. What do you think it will take to resolve the tension between advocates of synchronous and asynchronous programming models?
Would you like to?
Well,
She's good.
yeah, well, I mean, I'm no expert, but clearly, you know, synchronous models require lightweight threads.
Have you been spending some time in Silicon Valley?
I've been thinking a lot about Silicon Valley.
Did you actually have a real question? Well, actually, that was the right answer, I guess, right?
Yeah, since she's so good at this, I'm wondering if maybe I could even ask you another one. There is a suggestion that given increases in productivity over the past few decades, that the total number of jobs that the American economy can even have may be structurally less than the number of people who are in need of jobs, and even more so for jobs that can actually pay enough for someone to live on.
Right.
If this is really a fundamental structural reality we're going to have to deal with, how do we adjust to such a world?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that because I don't have a quick, glib answer to give you, but I can tell you that I would love to have any thoughts from all of you because you are making this new world. I mean, Google is a part of the future that is out there, and as I look around, you know, it's a very diverse crowd, a lot of young and youngish people who have...
I think they all look young to you.
Yeah,
and me.
they do. Who have skills and abilities that are really required in this new future. There is a serious political and economic dimension to that. And I don't think it's enough to basically say everybody else is just going to have to get used to it, live with it, because that is a recipe for not only increasing inequality, but what inequality does to social cohesion, to democratic institutions. So I think it's one of the most serious questions we have to figure out how to answer. Now, you know, there are some obvious quick answers, like you have subsidized employment for people in certain areas, so at least they have something to do all day, every day. You try to figure out how you create incentives for companies to keep people employed instead of making them unemployed. The German system where the government basically subsidizes you to avoid layoffs, but then you got to figure out what to do with people. I mean, there are no easy answers. And given the intellectual brain power in here, the United States may be getting to this sooner than other parts of the world. Everybody is going to get to it.
Exactly.
I mean, right now the Chinese are trying to figure out how they continue taking tens of millions of people out of rural areas, bringing them to urban areas, and putting them to work when wages are going to rise, when their economic advantage then may be diminished. So this is a huge social, political, economic issue. And if you've got any thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Let's have a quick question over here.
Secretary Clinton, it's an honor to have you here. I saw you on The Daily Show recently where Jon Stewart preemptively announced your candidacy for president. Now, I took my daughter about 6 years ago to the Democratic primaries to vote for you. In the face of so many people who are interested in
Is she above
having
18? She's old enough to vote?
She came to be with me.
I love the fact
just
you did
checking.
that.
How do you, I mean, I thought you handled it quite graciously, but how are you going to handle when there are so many people who are obviously interested in having you in this next election?
Thank you. Well, Jon Stewart was a lot of fun. And I love the story of taking your daughter. We always took Chelsea to vote. I mean, really, I think every 18-year-old should be automatically registered to vote upon turning 18. I think we need to get young people involved in our politics, making these decisions. This is a very personal decision for me, and I don't take it at all lightly. I'm sort of feeling my way through it and toward it. I think we face some very serious, hard choices as a nation, and I have no illusions about what a president alone can do, because it's necessary to bring the Congress, to bring the private sector, to get people from all walks of life involved. But I think we're at a real juncture. And I'm well aware that I have a lot of experience. I've seen the presidency up close now over 20 years, both because of my husband, and also I worked closely with George W. Bush after 9/11, because I was a senator from New York, and we had to rebuild, Lower Manhattan, and then obviously working closely and becoming not just a partner, but a friend of President Obama. So I am going to take my time, because I know that once I decide if I am going to run, it's nonstop. And the campaigns are even more demanding than they were 4 years ago. And so, I've talked with people in the Obama campaign, and they basically say, 2012 was so much more advanced technologically and in terms of voter outreach than 2008, and we don't even know what's going to be required in 2016. And I'm sure, a lot of you, because of what you work on, invent, and the like, will be part of that. So I want to be sure that it's the right decision for me, and that I will not just, I say in the book, you shouldn't ask somebody, in my opinion, whether they're going to run or if they think they can win. Those are the easy questions. And most people who run for president, no matter what you think they can win, or they wouldn't do it. But really, what's your vision for America, and can you lead us there? And I think that's going to require, and it goes to the great question that was asked over here, that's going to require some really careful analysis and agenda setting. Because in my opinion, whoever runs, and certainly if I were to run, I would want to run on as specific an agenda as possible, because I don't want there to be any illusions. We don't have time for people to, just think in very general terms, because we have to get a consensus coming out of this next election about what we're going to do to solve these problems. And hopefully bring some people into the Congress on both sides of the aisle who are willing to compromise and make those tough calls. So I'm thinking about it, and I hope you'll say hello to your daughter for me.
So Secretary Clinton, we have a way of asking people during the audience what the most important question is. And when you became First Lady, your name was determined by the tradition of First Lady.
True.
And Googlers want to know the following question. They want to know the name of President Clinton in a scenario where there's another President Clinton. Googlers have indicated that there are two choices. The first one is Bill. So it would be Ms. President and Bill, okay, which would have a certain gender equality, Mr. Clinton and the First Lady. And the second one is First Laddie. So we're going to Google does things by consensus and by votes. So we're going to determine this for you now.
Oh my.
So I need a sign of hands of all, those are your two choices. She should call him Bill. She should call him First Laddie. The decision is made. We're announcing it today, Mrs. Clinton. He's going to be called First Laddie. Would you like to respond?
Oh my goodness.
If not.
That's very good, Eric. Oh, I have to say.
Bill. I would have voted for Bill.
Yeah.
Myself.
There was one choice that I'm more partial to. Not that this is a hypothetical. Not that I responded. And that's first mate. I kind of like
first
that.
Mate?
First mate.
Miss Clinton and first mate? Come on, you can do better than that.
Well, we have to see.
I think you can see, first place, we're going to have a book signing after this in Tunis. I think you can see in Secretary Clinton, Senator Clinton, First Lady Clinton, a person of enormous impact on our world, somebody who has spent her entire life with this prodigious mind trying to serve us. I'm proud to be your friend, and I admire everything you've done, and I know people in this audience feel the same way.
Thank you.
Congratulations,
Thank you all so
Secretary.
very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was great. That was
First mates.
That was great. Oh.
And when it's over